So this is one of those things I really appreciate having the opportunity to do this talk. When somebody asks you to do an invited presentation, you kind of get to do whatever you want. And so I've never done this before. It's kind of an experiment. And I realized that I could talk about some area that I've worked in specifically, whether it's fluency-based instruction or sales enablement or more recently performance improvement. But what I recognized was, if I want to look back on it, there's a sort of a theme that I was not so clear about until I started thinking about this, which is reflected in the title here, about simplicity. Because I think if I've made a contribution over the years, I think it has more to do with trying to make our science accessible to a lot of folks, most of whom are not in this immediate community. And so let me see if I can make that a little bit clearer. Oops. There you go. Now this is a funny thing. This is my stepmother. She's no longer with us, but one of her phrases used to be, "Simpler is better." She was a very wise woman and had a lot of influence on me in a certain way. And so I just wanted to show a picture of Stella because I'd never done that in public. I want to talk a little bit, for starters, about why simple is better. And it's probably fairly obvious, but if you're trying to communicate with regular folks who are not, you might say, behavior science nerds like the rest of us, you want faster comprehension. You want people to get it with fewer errors. You want to, if possible, and in the organizations that I work with especially, you want the communication to be almost viral. You want people to pick it up. You don't want the language to get in the way. You want people to be engaged sooner rather than later. And ideally, you want people to be able to share whatever it is you're trying to give them in a way that's frictionless, that allows them to collaborate. So that's kind of the rationale for why simple. This kind of started out with one of my main mentors, Ogden Lindsley. And some of you may or may not know that Ogden was one of the earliest adopters of the Apple II computer. He always bragged about this, and he was something like Apple computer number 312 or something like that. And he was teaching educational computing very early on in the 70s with the Apple II, at the end of the 70s when it became available. And the thing about, he turned me on to Steve Jobs, basically, and he turned me on to Apple. And if you think about what the Apple II was, and then the Macintosh, and all of Apple technology, it was taking kind of nerdy, complicated technology and combining it in a form, so instead of it being some hobbyist electronic gizmo thing, a housewife could look at her recipes in the kitchen on the Apple II. And so I started paying attention to that user experience and that simplicity thing early on. And this is a long quotation, and you're not supposed to have this much text on a screen. But there's a book called Insanely Simple that's about Steve Jobs' sort of commitment to simplicity. And when I saw this quotation, it just reminded me of what I've tried to do over the years. He says, when you start looking at a problem and it seems really simple with all these simple solutions, you don't really understand the complexity of the problem. And your solutions are way too simplified and they don't work, or maybe they don't work as well as they could. And then you get into the problem and you see it's really complicated. And you come up with all these convoluted solutions, and that's sort of the middle. And it's where most people stop, and the solutions tend to work for a while. But if you can keep on going and find the key underlying principle of the problem and come up with a beautiful, elegant solution that works. So to me, that in many ways reflects what I've been trying to do for a long time. I'm no Steve Jobs, but that kind of rationale has always driven me. Now again, starting out with Ogden, one of the things that Lindsley did when he went from being a premier laboratory behavior scientist working with Skinner and humans at the Harvard Medical School, and as he, being Ogden was escaped, he flew bombers in the Second World War, and he was shot down behind enemy lines, and he escaped German prison camps. And so he used metaphors sometimes, and he used to talk about when he went to the special education department at Kansas University, he was parachuting behind enemy lines, which I always got a kick out of. But one of the things he was doing is trying to take the language of behavior science and make it accessible to regular special ed teachers and regular teachers who didn't have anything like the background that we have. And so one of the things he did is he created a plain English vocabulary. And one of my favorite examples is negative reinforcement, which of course in our field is one of those kind of hairball terms that everybody gets complicated about. He called it relief, which makes perfect sense. It's intuitive. You can understand what it's about. It's about essentially escape or avoidance. So that's an example that influenced me early on of plain English. And And so that was a big deal. Now, when I first left the laboratory, I worked in a laboratory and a lab classroom for about 10 years in the 70s. And, you know, I basically thought we all were the smartest people in the world. I thought we knew about behavior, you know. If you know about behavior, you could do anything. But I, not too long thereafter, met some really, really smart sales and marketing people. And I realized that's why, in some cases, they pay them the big bucks. Because these people had a focus on the customer, a focus on the audience that had a big impact, at least the good ones, on how they did stuff. And so that was an early influence as well. One of my favorite, I still quote this, back in the 90s when we were working with sales organizations, there was a VP of sales in one of our clients who said, well, you're not too bad for a guy with a PhD. And to me, that was a big compliment. I was like, oh, okay, so he kind of likes me, and apparently I'm not being too nerdy for him. So in a way, what I want to talk about today is elements of marketing communication for behavior scientists. How do we get the word out, and how do we engage people? And what are some of the views or some of the sort of principles we can follow? Now, the word nerd is a word that I've been using for years in reference to myself. And I'll bet a lot of people in this room can kind of identify with that. We love our stuff, right? And, you know, corporate salespeople refer to what many of us do as technical telling. So in other words, you got the salesperson and he comes or she comes in and starts telling you about all his or her cool stuff and why you should like it. And from a sales and marketing point of view, that's not it. That's not the correct answer. But we're so excited about our thing that we tend to do that. We like our stuff, right? And what I worked for about 15 years in enabling product launches for companies of all kinds. And many of those companies were high tech. And they'd have engineers and scientists, you know, like biotech companies, high-tech software, hardware companies. And I learned that we're not the only ones, that scientists and technologists who have something are really into their thing, and they want to tell you about it. And we surely have some cool stuff. We can change the world potentially. And we think, if I may speak for us, we think everybody should like it. We think that people, of course, this is the most important stuff. Now, again, from Steve Jobs, another quotation that I think reflects a change in perspective. Steve said, you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and then try to figure out where you can sell it. Now, one of my favorite examples from Steve Jobs' world is that there were MP3 players long before there was the iPod, but they were clunky and they wouldn't hold enough songs and they weren't easy to use. And so the iPod, which was not a dramatically new concept, represented a way, as Jobs said, to put 1,000 songs in your pocket. And so there's a focus on the customer and a focus on customer experience that I think we as behavior scientists need to take into account. So I want to talk through and show you examples in my work of three kind of chunks of my history. And the first one had to do with precision teaching, because I had the good fortune of being kind of an early precision teaching guy in the early 70s, and eventually became, you know, deeply involved in talking about behavioral fluency and, I would say, evangelizing it, frankly. But there was a point, even maybe especially among our colleagues in the behavior science world, where people had kind of the wrong impression about what we were doing. And they would ask questions like, well, why are you forcing kids to go fast? You know, I was like, oh, well, I'm not so sure we are. Our response tended to be, well, what does competence look like? What does it look like to be good at something? That's a better question. And so, you know, this is some data. And these are some data we collected in our classroom in 1978. And there's, if you look, you can see the data, there's three groups there. The black bars are, as we say, regular. And this was, you have to recognize, this was the 70s where the phrases severely and profoundly retarded were okay. Those were clinical terms. So that's why this still says non-retarded adults. But basically, these were people with graduate degrees for the most part. And then we had some regular little kids, public school students between 5 and 7 years old, who you know, didn't have any diagnoses. And then we had state school students, the students we were working with, which was in a classroom in an institution at the Fernald State School in Massachusetts for people who'd been basically living in the institution their whole lives, and we were trying to teach them pre-academic and pre-vocational skills. And you may not be able to see the details there, but we have a bunch of very simple component skills, putting pegs into a pegboard, copying various strokes, writing numbers, naming pictures, and so forth. And what we did is a series of 30-second timings with groups in each of these three categories. And it came out, you know, pretty clear. These are rate, count per minute of correct responding data. And you, without even looking at the details, you can see that pretty much the whole range of the black bar, which is the competent adults, was higher than higher count per minute than the range of the regular little kids, than the range of our students. Now, if you saw these people walking across the parking lot or sitting in a room and talking or whatever, you would say, yeah, that about reflects it. But of course, if we use percentage correct, we couldn't tell a difference because they would all be the same. They're all 100% accurate. But the answer, in any case, to the question about why are you making these kids go fast was pretty simple. It's because if you look at what competent adults can do, those black bars represent that. And we're trying to do our best to enable our students to function in the community that requires that level of performance. So Precision Teachers started defining that as the goal. And over time, over a number of years in the 70s, we were calling it different things. You know, we used to call it mastery. We talk about mastery learning. The problem with that is, if you look at the learning literature, mastery learning is usually measured as 100% correct, you know, without any time dimension. And then we started using the word proficiency, because that's another word that people use to describe being good at something. And that wasn't bad, and you can go back and look at some of the early precision teaching literature and see that. But toward the end of the 70s, Eric Houghton, who is one of my greatest mentors and really the guy responsible in many ways for much of what we even know today about precision teaching, we were speaking, and a couple of other colleagues, we realized the word fluency was already out there. It was used by reading specialists, and anybody in the room would know what it means to be, for example, fluent in speaking Japanese or French. It's not just getting the words right, it's doing it smoothly, quickly, easily. So we glommed onto that word because it implied the time dimension. And we were in the lineage of B.F. Skinner, where he said his most important contribution was rate of response, his measure. That is, response, count of responses over time. So we adopted the word fluency. And that had a big impact, because instead of telling people about our, what some people call our cultish blue graph, and all the details of it, and why you should like it, and how cool it is that it's multiply, divide, and blah, 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 we could say, well, wait a minute, let's talk about fluency. That's what we're trying to achieve here. You know what that means. It turns out we can measure it. And if you use this tool, you can help people achieve that. And it kind of changed the game. Because now we could go to regular people, instead of having them be kind of overwhelmed by this blue chart, which turns out to be fairly easy. Little kids use it, but that's beside the point. The thing was, oh, of course, we want fluency, so that would draw people in. So to me, this was an example of how we focused on the customer, basically, and kind of changed the game. And now I'm really happy to know, as we say, the F word is pretty popular, not only in this community, but elsewhere. It's a way people understand mastery. So that's a simple example. Now, we can talk about the definition of fluency, and those are some data, those are some descriptions that are different things, but they're all got the time dimension in them. And so again, fluency is a good word for that. We can talk about levels of performance, where people can't do anything in the beginning, and then we have beginner level, and it's kind of not very accurate and slow. And then we say, oh, 100% correct. And people used to refer to that as mastery learning. But how many of you ever tried to get your students to be 100% correct all the time? That's pretty hard. People say, oh, well, best 9 out of 10 is good. But the point is, that's not good enough, because what we learned was that you have to be not just accurate, but you got to be quick. So that's how we define true mastery, and we recognize then that there can be a whole technology of practice and a whole approach to redesigning materials and procedures. And out of that came the notion of stages of learning, where we would design our programs in these 3 simple stages, where initial learning, where you might use discrete trials training, or you might use whatever it takes, clicker training, tag teaching, and then you find a way to allow the student to be more self-paced, and you build up that pace. And then once those components are fluent, you put them in combination to build application. There's a whole technology in precision teaching that people like Kent Johnson and the folks at Fit Learning have refined and developed over the years. But it's all about fluency. And we can summarize it in simple terms, and notice that that's not too complicated to look at. That's the version that I used for my corporate trainees, or people that I was, instructional designers that I was teaching. So I'd use the word fluency blockers and fluency builders, simple language that they could understand. So this whole history for me was an example of making something accessible that was actually based on pretty nerdy science in the end. You know, this is the application of Skinner's variable in the classroom. So one thing then that came out of that, and this is actually an example, I want to talk a little bit more about it, was some principles, and I'm going to mention some people that have some connection to our science, but are sort of outside the ABAI world, and I want to talk about those in a couple minutes. Some of the principles that came out of their work that I've applied are chunking, labeling, and hierarchical organization, and I'll say what I mean by that in a minute. I realized as I was doing this presentation that there was even two versions of our communication here. The one on the left, which is a 1996 article that I published a few years ago, and I was really humbled and blown away to learn that it's one of the most cited things in the history of the behavior analyst. That was a shock to me, actually. But then the one on the right was written for people in the corporate training world, real simple, none of the sort of nerdy scientific language in it. It was very appealing to our corporate folks. So that's the first example. That's kind of how I cut my teeth in this idea of trying to be simple, straightforward, and plain English. But I want to show you a couple more examples where there's some guiding principles that started to become conscious in my work. One of them is that simple is not the same as simplistic. Now that's an important point, and I really made contact with that when I started to encounter marketing people and sales enablement and sales training people in corporations. Because we wanted to help them, as I'll show you in a minute, to identify the needs of their customers so that they could then sell to those needs. But what we found in a lot of places was the marketing communications guys said, well, we have to make this simple and digestible. So we'll just give them the top 5 needs rather than the whole list of needs that might be there. And my response was, well, but wait a minute, what if my client has like a 19th need down here? That's important to them. So that to me was an example of making things simplistic, basically by, we want to integrate and synthesize. We don't want to truncate. We don't want to cut it down. We don't want to eliminate stuff. We want to make it simpler by integrating and synthesizing things into easier to digest ways of communication. So one of the guys that I think you should get to know, and there's a couple of URLs down there that you can find a lot of his work, is a man named Bob Horn, Robert Horn. And he's an old friend of mine. He's in his 80s now. He's still kicking. He's doing great work. But Bob was originally a programmed instruction person at Columbia University back in the day when that was happening. But he was more interested in documentation and written communication than in the instructional part. So he developed a methodology called the information mapping method, which became a company and was commercialized, and I made contact with in the early 80s. And it incorporated a bunch of principles that he pulled from program instruction, from the work that was done on chunking, from things about the use of pictures and words to communicate. And that's just a list of those things. But Bob's work had a big impact on me because I realized we could take large amounts of stuff, and if we structured it properly, if we created hierarchical organization, if we used chunking and labeling, if we used pictures to our advantage, we could make it a lot easier for people to access. So for example, this is just a piece, I actually picked this off of, I think, Home Depot or something. I can't remember. This is a website. But I thought it was a cool example because this is a long list, right? But notice, they chunked it into subsets, they labeled it clearly, and it's got a hierarchical organization because once you have the major topics, then you have subtopics, and we could probably, if that were a live web page, we could probably drill down to the next level of description of those products. So the whole notion of chunking and labeling and hierarchical organization is relevant when you're creating materials for parents, when you're creating materials to advertise, when you're trying to communicate with people, to make it digestible. And again, don't shorten it to the top 5, don't truncate. Here's another influence. I don't know how many, anybody here know about Edward Tufte? Okay, well if you don't, He does a traveling road show in which he does a one-day lecture. He is a brilliant man, and the Visual Display of Quantitative Information was his first book. And he's about how do you display information in a way that people can use it. And so I just want to mention him because he's a resource to go to that's aesthetically pleasing, but he also has a lot of principles that apply to what's the best way to present stuff visually. He influenced a lot of what the work I did subsequently with sales enablement. And so this is a second example I want to talk to you about. Og Lindsley kind of kicked me out of education. He told me about 1979, he said, look, he said something like, you dress up pretty good, so I want you to take what we've learned from precision teaching and go into the corporate world. So I said, okay, I don't know anything about that, but I did it. And I almost went bankrupt a couple times and stuff. But the first application that I kind of encountered was, this was the early 80s, and banks had been deregulated, and they were trying to turn bankers into salespeople. So I had been talking about fluency a lot in this world of adult training for a while. And so I had the vice president of a company come to me and say, well, can you apply this fluency stuff to product knowledge? And I didn't really know what he was talking about because I didn't know much about it. But I started to look more carefully at what does that mean? And really the question was fluency in what? You know, it wasn't just like, let's not just take a whole lot of facts about the products and get fluent on them. What is it that we really want people to be fluent in? So I started looking at that. And here's another behavior scientist that you may not know about whose work I encountered. Neil Rackham was a researcher in the UK studying dyadic relationships. He'd observe and analyze behavior in various kinds of, you know, one-to-one communications. And they said, can you take a look at salespeople? So he began to do that, and over the years what happened was he actually started a company. He learned what exemplary salespeople do. He started a company, he published a bunch of books, he became famous, he made $1 zillion, but it was all based on this core observation of salespeople. And what he discovered was, in watching, and he and his colleagues watched something like 20, 30,000 interactions, sales interactions, is that in any effective sales discussion, there's this thing called spin. First of all, you ask some questions about what's your situation, what's going on in your world if you're the salesperson. And once you do that, you then try to say, well, what problems or issues do you have? And then you have a conversation about, well, what are the implications of those for you? Like, what kind of trouble is that causing for you, really? Where's that going? And then you get to a need. So, okay, so tell me how we could help, what need we could address. So there's this logic that goes from the customer situation to their need that's at the core of exemplary sales work. When we went and took a look at what most companies were doing in the sales enablement world, we realized this is not how they were doing it, because they were starting out doing sales skills training much like Neil suggested. They were saying, well, you ought to have conversations with your salespeople, or excuse me, with your customers, and understand their problems and needs, and then get to a point where you can address the needs. But the problem is that you then go down to the product training class, if you were the salesperson, and they would be dumping features and benefits, which is basically a way to say, see, I have this cool thing, and this is why you should like it, which is not really needs-based. It's not customer-focused. And then, and you've probably seen this even as a consumer, they'd have competitive information where they'd say, well, ours is bigger, faster, cheaper than yours. And again, I may not care about those features you're talking about. I want to know how it'll address my needs. So we recognized there was a problem here. And it was that it wasn't customer-focused. It was not, it was product-focused. It was about our thing. It was just about like our precision teacher saying, look at this cool chart. Or just, you know, like the rest of us saying, this RFT is really cool, you know, whatever it is. That's not it. We need to show how it helps the customer. So this is a little bit of a geeky picture, but it's a picture that I used a lot in the early 80s and 90s. I used to call it my War of the Worlds picture. But the idea is that if we're trying to do product knowledge, so-called, for salespeople, a product-focused approach, those orange blocks would be the features of the product. And then the advantages and benefits are the little legs. And then this is what's unique about our thing and why you should buy it. Now that's great if you happen to be interested in the features that the marketing or sales guy is talking about. But what we really need is something that starts out with needs. We need to chunk the needs into some categories, those big blue balls, and then those needs can be addressed by certain features of the product, and that'll follow in the logic of being customer focused. So we tried to play that out in our work. We tried to go from features and benefits, you know, our thing, to needs and solutions. And so, for example, and you know, this is probably, I shouldn't have included this slide, but this is a simple architecture. It's essentially a table of contents for sales information. That could be online, it could be in paper form or whatever. But those three orange ones are about potential customer needs, how our products address those needs, and how our products address the needs better than the other products, as opposed to how much cooler our products are. So we began to play that out, and I had a company for about 15 years that focused on that. We used pictures. Here's a picture of the needs categories for a blood gas analyzer sold to hospitals. And so the kinds of needs that a customer might have for those were about professional development needs, implementation needs, technical needs. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories. And a salesperson could remember those 5 categories. And he or she could probe for those kinds of needs in the customer. So it made it simple with pictures, and it created a chunking and hierarchical organization. This is another one for an insurance company. There's 5 categories of needs. Now these would play out in documentation and training that might go on for pages. But there was an advanced organizer, and there was a chunking and labeling process that enabled people to work through this stuff in a way that was simple. And so we were able to ramp salespeople up very rapidly when we added Fluency-based coaching and instruction to that. Here's an example of a value proposition. Instead of saying, here's our cool thing and why you should like it, we'd say, we want to talk about a need. Here's how our thing addresses the needs and how it works, and here's the value delivered. So an example, for instance, for the blood gas analyzer would be, we need more consistent results from our blood gas testing. Well, our product has automated sampling, and that eliminates the variability that's caused by different users kind of messing up the process. And so this decreases your cost. So that goes from needs to solutions. Here's another, and here's a competitive one, where we say there's a need that the customer has, there's a solution, there's a competitive solution, and here's how we win. So an example, we did actually the product training when Microsoft first was going after the business market with Office products in 1990, 1991. And so in those days, they were selling against a product called Lotus 123. Some of you may be old enough to remember that. And this was, well, I need to protect my investment. I got all these data in Lotus 123 format. They say, well, we've got a data import tool, and it'll help you do that because it brings in the data from Lotus 123. And, oh, wow, okay, that's good. So the point is we're going from needs to solutions. Now, I don't want to bore you with all the details about sales enablement, but the point is a focus toward the customer's needs and how we can address them as opposed to how cool our stuff is. So one third example, which is the work that I now do, which is basically performance improvement in large organizations. And so we set out as a goal, it's 15 years ago now, that we wanted to be able to go into big companies and do the equivalent of OBM, but we would call it performance improvement, probably would be the name we'd use. And we wanted to not just have nerdy performance consultants and staff people who go do their magic and big complicated stuff. We wanted to engage leaders and managers and individual contributors at every level in the organization in participating in performance improvement. In order to do that, we're going to have to make it simpler. And so the idea was we wanted to do what OBM and performance improvement people do, which is we wanted to analyze and communicate about human performance in ways that people can do stuff with it that's actionable and that's evidence-based. But we wanted to use simple visual models and plain language because we wanted to be able to enable anybody across any level and function to be able to use this stuff because we wanted to build communities of practice, to drive collaboration, et cetera. And so our clients, as we started to do this work, and I'll show you the models, called it performance thinking. Because they didn't feel like we were laying a trip on them with a whole bunch of complicated stuff. What they recognized is we were teaching them to think a little bit differently about performance. And so let me sort of play that one out for you. Here's some typical models from that world. And these are from a single article in the 90s that summarized performance improvement. It was one of the International Society for Performance Improvement's publications. And they're all good. But they're kind of complicated. And they were created by different thought leaders. And I had clients and colleagues who would say, oh, we've tried to use that, you know? And there's all these different ones. But it was too complicated, and our leaders and our managers would say, this is information overload, or this is too much, or oh my God, look at all that stuff. This is the one that ISPI has had on their website for years. And I call it the everything, including the kitchen sink model. And it's all good, but it's overwhelming. So I came into this field, really into the field of performance improvement, encountering Tom Gilbert's work. But Tom's work started with the three-term contingency. Those of you who don't know about Tom Gilbert, he basically came into this field, into the field of whatever, performance improvement, through programmed instruction, and then he recognized that there was more than skills and knowledge that were needed to improve performance. And so, you know, he was a postdoc for a while with Skinner, and he knew about the three-term contingency. Now, the challenge with the three-term contingency, as many of you know who are in behavioral systems work and so forth, is that it's great for white Carnot pigeons and hooded rats who are starved to 80% body weight, so we know they're reinforcers, who have manipulanda that are designed for their particular paws, beaks, or whatever their body parts are, et cetera, who, we know that they're sensitive to color versus whatever for SDs. But in the world of work, as Gilbert called it, it's a little more complicated than that. So he developed what he called the behavior engineering model. And the behavior engineering model has two rows. It has the environment, the stuff that's in the environment, and then it has the stuff that's in the individual. Because there's individual differences among us humans that are worth taking into account. So in the environment, there's data. There's all the information we get, both to set expectations and to give us feedback. There's what he called instruments, which is all the stuff in our physical and social environment that essentially enables us to respond. And then he used the word incentives to talk about consequences. And then the individual brings knowledge to the table. That is an pre-existing repertoire is a way to think about that. And he used the word capacity to refer to the fact that as individuals, we're all suited for different kinds of jobs. So when we get hired, or when we get put in a position or assigned to a task, hopefully there's a matchup between our ability to be analytical, or our skill set, or our preferences, or our personality, or whatever it is, with the requirements of the job. So there's a selection and assignment part of that. And then motives is the way that Tom dealt with functional definition of consequences. Because you can have all the incentives in the world, but if they're not reinforcers, they ain't going to work. So we have to understand what actually motivates the individual. Now, this was a great model. And when I first saw it in the early 80s, I was down in the knowledge box. I was doing fluency-based instruction and coaching for salespeople. But we realized real quickly, as I'm sure everybody here recognizes, that you can train people really well, but if you don't do some of the other things, it's probably not going to stick. It's like when it's a little bit like when you hear the mayors and police chiefs say, well, we're going to get rid of people, killing people of color by giving them more training. I'm not so sure that's going to work. I think there's some other factors that need to be taken into account. So we got it real quickly, and this model was fantastic because it gave us a framework for looking at the other variables. However, when we tried to use it to partner with our clients and colleagues and folks that didn't have our background and who didn't love the conceptual framework, they looked kind of confused, and they'd say, like, what do you mean by instruments again? And like data, is that a spreadsheet or from, what do you mean by that? So I spent about 3 years trying different language in those cells until I came up with this language. And it was user tested, because the way I knew I had the right language was, as we were working with this, trying different stuff, I remember now very clearly, I'd be on my way out of a consulting day, and somebody would ask me a question, and I'd sit down with them for maybe 5-10 minutes, draw this thing on the back of an envelope or a piece of paper, talk through them a little bit, and they'd sort of say, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I came back a bunch of times later where people would have the napkin on their, cubicle wall or something, and they'd say, I've been using that. And they weren't brilliant performance consultants, but they were using it without errors pretty darn well in simple ways. So we knew, we got this language. So that was kind of my introduction to taking language, which I loved and was nerdy, kind of in the behavior engineering world, and creating some terminology which would produce fewer errors, basically, which people would get right up front more quickly. And then the second part of what I got from Tom Gilbert was his focus on accomplishments. And he said in Human Competence, the book he published 40 years ago now, it's still a classic, this was kind of a poke in our eyes as behaviorists, I suppose, but he said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So he pointed out that in any enterprise, in any organization, behavior is costly. What we care about is the valuable contributions that behavior makes to the organization. So that got us thinking, how do we teach this? And what I learned early on was, I used to think it's because I hung out with trainers and behavior analysts that people had a hard time distinguishing between behavior and accomplishments. And what I started to realize, I think it's just us humans. I think we humans are accustomed to observing, thinking about, talking about behavior. We may not be very precise about it if we're not trained behavior scientists, but we talk a lot about our activity. We don't talk that much about the details of what we produce of value. And so I created a couple models. I took the 6 boxes model, you can see, and then we have this very simple model called the performance chain. Now, I know that the behavioral systems people in our community will say, wait a minute, that doesn't take everything into account. Well, it turns out we can start with this. And the top 4 boxes, the things there on that kind of flow, are the elements of performance. They're the definitions of performance. And what they say is we start with the end in mind, which is what's at stake for the business or the organization. Once we're clear on that, we then say, what do people have to produce? And I switched from using the word accomplishments to using the phrase work outputs, because what I learned was, in fact, if you go in the dictionary, the word accomplishments has more definitions related to behavior than to things. And accomplishments are things. They should be countable nouns to get sort of a little bit, fine grain about it. So we want to know what people contribute that add to or contribute to business results. Once we got that, we can figure out what the behavior is that's needed to produce that, and we can even identify, exemplary behavior. And then we talk about behavior influences, and the 6 boxes model helps us make sense of this. Now, there's 21 words and 2 pictures there, and it's pretty simple on the surface of it. And what we've learned is we can go into organizations where we can take performance professionals like training and development people, organizational development people, HR people, process people, and we can teach them to do a lot of good stuff that's relevant to their work using those models. And we can take managers and coaches that are working with the individuals in their teams, and we can help them define the work outputs that their people need to produce, figure out what the behavior is to produce it, use the 6 boxes model to configure ways to accelerate or improve that. And we can also work with leaders at a higher level in the organization to do strategic planning, to do employee engagement planning, and so forth. 21 words, 2 pictures. We found that this really works. And so basically, and now we're at a point where we can do things like go into an organization, put in one company 500 plus managers through a program that teaches those models and how to use it, and begin to build a culture based on this shared language, because it's pretty easy and it's in fact viral. So just to kind of summarize, these are some of the principles that I think you can derive from what I just said. First of all, as much as you can, use plain language. Use it precisely, but use words that the initial response from your audience is not filled with errors. And then you can refine it, but essentially use words that it's like you go to Spain speaking Spanish kind of thing, but find the right words. Second thing is lead with user experience. And so just like with the Macintosh or some other things, what we want to be able to do is say, okay, how easy is it for people to use this? How accessible is it? Do they get enthusiastic because they get it, et cetera? So really look from the customer or user's perspective to create your language and your models and your communications. Focus on customer needs, which is really just kind of a subset of that second one. Instead of saying, here's my cool methodology, I'm going to show you how cool it is, and let me tell you about scorecards and all that. Say, wait a minute, what is it we're trying to accomplish here? How can I help you? What do you need? Oh, you need your people could use some feedback. I see, that makes sense. And then you'll eventually get to the scorecards. But don't start with all the cool stuff. Start with how to help the person or the organization. Chunk, label, and organize in tree structures. If anybody really wants to get good at structured information design or information, structured documentation, go to information mapping and take one of their courses, because it'll teach you how to take big hunks of stuff and make it accessible to people. And then integrate words and pictures. Try to make it simple. Try to use visual communication that involves both pictures and words in useful ways, not in just aesthetically pleasing ways. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, and we've got 8 minutes, and those are 2 websites that you can find more information than you'd ever like to find, probably. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to respond. Or not. Thank you.